Bismillah.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Ahmed Abu Hakma, and I'm joined today with Imam Jafar Sabkhawi and Brother Kareem Abdul Mateen from the Al-Hidaya Center out of Latham, New York, to begin what should be, inshallah, a series of healing discussions on racism. Today's talk is titled Let's Talk, reflecting on the current events surrounding George Floyd. Just some housekeeping before we start. This event is being live streamed on YouTube, as you should have received through the various social media platforms and email messaging that you maybe received the Al-Hidaya messages from, as well as the live Facebook page for the Al-Hidaya Center. So you can access those two pages to watch this stream, and that's where questions should be forwarded. Please drop questions either on the Facebook stream or on the YouTube live stream, and those will be forwarded to us after our discussion. Email messaging that you is from, as well as the live Facebook page. Hussam, I'm hearing some feedback there. Okay. So before we get started with our discussion with our beloved Imam Jafar and Brother Kareem Abdul Mateen, it's important for us to restate the background events that brought us to where we are in our current climate, and that requires us to recount the tragic and horrific murders of Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, and Breonna Taylor. And while the name of the event talks about the current events surrounding George Floyd, I'd be remiss to not make mention of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor. Chronologically speaking, the events happened first. Ahmaud Arbery was the first one to be murdered on February 23rd when he was jogging through Brunswick, Georgia, and he was chased down and executed on a jog. He was executed, and one of the people who executed him was an ex-police officer. The person who videotaped the incident later indicates that his killer, that Ahmaud Arbery's killer, on top of executing him, also called him profanities, namely the N-word, multiple times. Then on May 13th, we learned of the tragic passing of Breonna Taylor, who was an EMT who had aspirations to be a nurse. Police officers were executing a highly problematic search warrant in the dead of night, and they broke in without warning, without knocking. They broke in to her apartment, and they shot her with at least 8 rounds of ammunition. Breonna, as we said, was a devoted EMT with dreams set on becoming a nurse. Her boyfriend, Kenneth Walker, who had a license to carry, did what any of us would have done under those circumstances and protect their family under intruders. Obviously, the officers broke in without notifying in the dead of night, and anybody would have thought that that was an intruder. He was held in jail for 13 days before a judge ultimately dismissed the indictment without prejudice on May 26th. And then most recently, on May 25th in Minneapolis, Minnesota, the police responded to a call over an alleged counterfeit bill. And what we see in this video, and this was the most shocking one and was the one that really put the country in flames, was a 9-minute video of a man losing his life who was completely defenseless, whose final words were very devastating and horrible to hear, and it shook our very souls. And it's very difficult for me, weeks removed from this incident, to even look at my notes and repeat some of these, things. And so after having said that, I want to turn it to our panelists. Obviously, we have Imam Jafar, who's been the face of the Al-Hidaya community. He's been the Imam and a pioneer in the interfaith work in our community, as well as a chaplain to the Al-Hidaya MSA. And we have Brother Kareem Abdul Mateen, who's been a stalwart in the community. He's been a great friend. He's been a member of the board, and he's been professionally in his professional training a counselor. And he's seen a lot of these things, and he's seen a lot in terms of the civil rights struggles dating back to the 60s as well. So having said that and given that introduction, I want to ask Brother Abdul Mateen, as an African-American Muslim who's certainly seen a lot, how do you process the situation at hand in terms of current political climate and how it has unfolded?
Well, without getting into at this point a long historical discussion, I would say that it's for me personally, it's more of the same. This has been going on since I was born. I was born in in the 50s, and that was towards the end of what they call the Jim Crow, excuse me, the Jim Crow era, which was a caste system that at some point we can explain in more detail. But it was towards the end of that, before the federal civil rights laws were enacted. And the thing to keep in mind is that these type of things have been going on for the last over 100 years. Since slavery ended, this has been going on. The only difference now is that we have social media. These things can be documented and they can be publicized and transmitted around the world. But this has been normal, unfortunately, in this country. And I look at the situation that we have today, and it strikes me. One thing strikes me in particular is that there's a connection. The pandemic that we're going through, and this particular uprising in terms of protesting and whatnot, they will forever be linked. And I don't fully understand Allah's wisdom in that, but it's a fact. It will be linked. And there's some George Floyd in particular, his particular murder was very symptomatic, if you think about it and reflect on it. The police officer had his knee on his neck. And there were three other officers, and I don't even believe all of them were white, but there were three other officers who were standing around. And the knee on the neck has been obviously symbolized. George Floyd is symptomatic of the African American in this country, and how the system of institution of racism has impacted us. And what were his words? I can't breathe. That's not just that's what he said. That's what Allah brought out of him at that particular point. And that was symbolic of what all African Americans in this country say or think or feel. And then on top of that, you have three individuals standing around watching. Now, those three individuals could be anybody, but it's also symptomatic of people who kind of just have a laissez-faire attitude and don't want to get involved, don't want to intervene, and they watch from the sidelines. So that particular incident in and of itself is Allah sending a message to the whole world. And now we are at a point where it's a progression. And when I reflect back on civil rights, there's always, up until the middle of the 60s, we started the protesting in the 60s. And I was a teenager during that time, and I didn't quite understand exactly what was going on. But the thing that happened is that was a very tumultuous time in this country. The Democratic, it was a convention that was overrun and taken over in Chicago. There were a number of things that were going on. And you had some very outspoken voices during that time. It's a time of the names we famously remember: Martin Luther King, we remember Malcolm, but there were others, H. Rap Brown, and you now known Jamil El-Amin, Stokely Carmichael, and many, many, many others who were involved in that struggle. And out of that struggle, and that struggle was against that system of that caste system, the Jim Crow system, that was that was perpetuated throughout the South and the West, and in some cases the North. And as a result of that came the civil rights laws. Now we've taken a break. We took a break, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, or whatever. And now, but what that didn't change, it put laws in place, but it didn't change what was in people's hearts. And eventually they figured out a way to get around the laws. And now, so you have the laws on the books, but you still find the same system in place. It's just more subtle and more insidious. Okay, now we come to another turning point. And I honestly believe that this is a turning point in history, because it came at a perfect time, as what some people say, the perfect storm. You have a pandemic where you have millions of people out of work, which complicates the situation even further, the issue of poverty even further. You have Black people disproportionately being killed by this pandemic. And in addition to that, now you have these incidents that you mentioned that come up, and it's almost like enough is enough. The question is, where does it go from here? And I'll leave it at that point for right now.
SubhanAllah, thank you for sharing your wisdom and reflections with us, Brother Abdul Mateen. It's very provocative comments, and there's a lot of discussion that can be built off of that. Sheikh Jafar, I want to loop you in on this question. As a faith leader, how do you process some of the recent events that have unfolded?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Salatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. I would like to thank you, Ahmed, for actually initiating this kind of discussion. And I'm aware that you and Sheikh Yassin and maybe some others took the initiative to start something like this. I believe there are many layers of discussion that can take place. One of them is I would like to reflect on this from a humanitarian point of view. Just like I said today in Khutbat al-Jumu'ah, if there is one thing that this pandemic have taught us, I think it taught us that we human beings developed an arrogant culture. And that arrogant culture actually expresses itself in these kind of forms, like the form of racism, where sometimes when people are in a position of power, can't think or don't think, or sometimes don't want to think that actually that power can corrupt. And that corruption of power can lead to destruction, not only of a certain group, actually it ends up the destruction of the entire society. That's why actually I come to the next level, where now for all of us, wherever and regardless of the background where we come from, regardless of our position, whether we are speaking from on behalf of faith institutions, or we are speaking on behalf of political institution, or we are speaking of just as individuals, I believe our position and speaking up against dhulm, against aggression, transgression, against abuse, I think is a duty, because that is not only a duty to support a certain group. No, this is a duty first towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, towards our Lord, our creator, because it is mandatory for us to speak up, that is to say the truth, and to correct according to our ability of correcting. However, as we know, the rules from a Muslim perspective is that the correction should lead to a good, positive end, and it doesn't lead to something that is worse than what it is. So from that perspective, The humanitarian level is one. Number two, the faith position as people of faith, and as I have heard so far from almost everyone that I met, Christians, Jews, others who are speaking on behalf of their faithful institutions, they are all speaking the same tongue. They are all speaking the same message. That is, it is time that the system need to correct itself, so then everybody will be dealt with in a just way. That is the duty of all of us to say it, and that is the right of everyone to live freely in this piece of land and be able to enjoy their human rights and also to enjoy their rights as citizens. So from that perspective, what happened as you described it, and as Brother Karim Abdul Mateen explained to us briefly the history of what happened, I think all that goes in the same channel where things need to be done in a certain way, where the society must come up with solutions. So hopefully this pandemic, as I would like to call it, it's another pandemic. The racism is a worse pandemic than actually coronavirus, because coronavirus will kill the bodies, but racism will kill the spirit. And when the spirit is being killed, actually not only one generation will suffer, but many generations will suffer. So I hope, speaking on behalf of my community and on behalf of my masjid, I am sure many other places probably will echo the same thing.
Well said, Sheikh Jafar. Thank you for that input. It's definitely important to reflect on the humanitarian and faith responses that we're getting after this pandemic. And it is a pandemic. And I was hoping, and Jazakallah khair for pointing out, that it is a more serious pandemic. It was the initial sin of Iblis, and it is the sin that continues to plague people all over the world. And it's the sin that will keep it's aligned with the sin of arrogance that with which nobody will enter Jannah with a single ounce of it in their heart. And we ask that Allah allows us to purify ourselves from that. And we will go a deeper dive on the subject of racism in a subsequent section. For those of you who are tuning in, I just want to remind you, whether you're on YouTube or on Facebook, to please put your questions in the chat boxes as this stream is continuing. We will reserve time towards the end of the session to entertain your questions after our discussion here. Brother Abdul Mateen and Sheikh Jafar, we've heard about how this is a perfect storm, so to speak, as you pointed out, Brother Abdul Mateen, for this to finally unravel and reach a fever pitch or reach a boil. And we've heard from you, Sheikh Jafar, how the different faith communities have all spoken out unanimously in trying to hold up and bring justice to every citizen. My question is, what does it say about the conscience of a nation for it to have to come to this storm for us to finally unite on this front? On one hand, yes, we're happy that it's being done and that justice is finally being there. But on the other hand, it is disappointing to look back and to see that it took this many lives just to really begin to have serious discussions. The work has not been done, but just to begin having the serious discussions. What does that say about the conscience of a nation and where that conscience must go?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I think it speaks to, we're taught as Muslims to look in the mirror, and to look at ourselves, to reflect on ourselves internally and on our own spiritual diseases as individuals. This is an opportunity, and this is an occasion where this nation as a whole is looking at itself internally and seeing the ugliness that's really there. We know what the words of the Constitution say. They sound very good and they're very aspirational, but what is the reality? And it's telling, and we're at a point, regardless of what is being stated on paper and regardless of what is in the law book, we have a sickness. And it's a sickness that pervades the entire society. And I don't want to get into it in more detail, but I think the sickness is one, and Sheikh Jafar mentioned, the arrogance. But that aspect of it, it's a spiritual disease that manifests itself on many different levels. And in every individual has to look within themselves and to deal with that. But as a nation, we have to be honest and have the honest dialogue and honest reflection about who we really are, and then deal with it on that level. Deal with it individually and deal with it collectively.
SubhanAllah, Sheikh Jafar, anything you'd like to add?
Actually, I would like to ask, Brother Kareem Abdul Mateen further, maybe a more detailed and practical comparison between what happened in the 50s, the 60s, and then continue into the 70s, and then between what is happening right now. I'm sure probably he can see some elements that are positive and some others that are negative, where, for example, as I hear the news, almost in every city where these protests are going on, in some places, actually, the whites are the majority of the people who are protesting, and they are protesting with the black community. I think there is some change. Maybe we are not there yet for what it takes to bring a change, but I believe there is a change. That's one. Number two, of other minority groups who are participating in this as well. So it looks like it is not only the African American community. There are many other communities who are feeling concerned, and they are voicing their concern. So the question I would like to I like Brother Kareem Abdul Mateen from his experience, and actually he is in a unique position because Brother Kareem Abdul Mateen lived what happened in the 60s, and he's living what's happening right now. He lived it then before embracing Islam or before reverting to Islam, and after he reverted to Islam, and then now being part of the Muslim community, being part of a masjid, being actually in the leadership of a very important masjid in the capital district. I really would like to see the difference between then and now. Are we moving forward, or are we moving backward? What's missing? And actually, there are many questions that are going to come maybe later in other sessions, but at least for now, if we can lay the ground for some of those questions that will be addressed later on.
I believe that we are moving forward.
That's good.
It may not look like it, but I think that there's a couple of things that you point out. And one is the fact that these protests are not just primarily African American. There are a lot of white, there are a lot of people from other ethnic groups. Whereas in the 60s, there were still whites, but not on the level that we see today. And that's one thing. And the other thing, I think one other aspect of it is that the African-American community has had some taste of success on some level. They have a higher level, I believe, from my own personal opinion. They're probably a little bit more educated. They've seen things from around the world. They've studied struggles in other places. So they have something to compare and to look at. But I think the most significant difference, and this is not necessarily obvious at this point, Islam was not there at that time. Today, Islam is established in this country. And I firmly believe that when the Muslim community becomes really active in this struggle on whatever level that we deem is appropriate, we are the moral compass for this country. Okay, we can be the moral compass of this country. We have the Black leadership, the Black clergy, who has been the conscience of this struggle and will continue to be the conscience of this struggle. But I think now there's another voice, and that's the voice of the Muslim. And I think that that voice has to be heard, and it can't shy away from the microphone. It has to stand up and speak out along with others who can be. And I think that's probably in my mind, there's a number of things that are different. And I look at the strategies that are taking place now, and the violence that's taking place. Yes, there's some violence among the African-American community, but I think primarily now you see it's a lot more targeted, a lot more methodical in the way they're approaching it. They have lessons, they've learned lessons from the past in terms of how to initiate change. And those strategies that have been learned are now starting to be implemented. They understand where the gaps in the law are. They understand that we can never legislate morality, but we can legislate behavior. And I think that they have a very good sense of where they need to go and how they need to direct their struggle in order to make change. And this is a protracted struggle. This is not a one-shot. This is not something that will die out at the end of the summer. This has to be a protracted struggle. And I believe that the individuals, because this started prior to these events, and the acknowledgement that this is a protracted struggle and what it's going to take, it's not going to happen in weeks, it may not happen in months, it may take years to take it to the next level. So I think that's probably, in my mind, the biggest difference in that we've learned from the past, and we have some other avenues to express ourselves, inshallah.
I just want to add a little bit to that right there. We talked about how there may be some changes to legislation. It may be essentially more difficult for we have an awakening that will not extinguish very easily, and that's a good thing. And you mentioned that we can be, if we take basically the role that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us, we can be the moral compass of this country. And that's vital, and that's something that will be addressed in a further session in more detail. And also you pointed on the very important point that the Black voice needs to be heard, and needs to be heard in the Muslim community, needs to be heard in the broader community. And that's going to be the subject of a subsequent session, where we're going to do a deep dive on making inclusive prophetic communities, after having some discussions on how we rectify ourselves, and then we rectify the community itself by having all the constituents of it being meaningful members. There's a lot of people who feel a huge desire to do something and to help the situation, but there's a lot to unpack when we say this statement. A lot of people feel handcuffed and they're afraid to do something. And some people aren't afraid, they just don't know what to do. Maybe we can address these questions one by one. And maybe let's go with the first one. Some people feel handcuffed and are afraid to do something. What would be our message, or what would we want to say about those who have that desire to do something, but their desire is overpowered by the fear of doing something?
Well, from my perspective on that, I think that I've been thinking about this, and that if you look at the leaders of the civil rights movement from the 60s, they're kind of passing out, they're dying out. They're 70s and 80s and 90s, and they're going on. And this is a natural progression. Okay, now you have, and I'm speaking, and in the Muslim community, you have the first wave of, well, not really, primarily the first wave of immigrants who are, they're aged, as my daughter would say, they're grandparents at this point. And the energy level of that generation and the energy level of the young generation is not going to be the same. And I see some of the same energy in the younger generation that I saw back then. And you're right. It's a question of how do we express it? I think the key factor in all of this is that us as elders, we cannot handcuff them. We can direct them and advise them, but we cannot handcuff them. Okay, because our generation, we've become a little bit more comfortable in our living, and we don't want to rock the boat. We don't want to disturb things. Okay, so, and we don't have the same kind of energy to get out there and struggle and fight, but we cannot deny that younger generation. And I don't think there's so much fear on their part. I think the fear is on our part. Okay. And they may look at us and say, what's taking you guys? Why come you guys are not doing anything? That's a valid question. But I think that we have to, like I said, do not handcuff them. We have to help them, advise them, and hopefully our wisdom kind of give them some direction. There are things that can be done, and that's a separate discussion. But I think that we have to kind of harness that energy and direct it, and be the mentors behind that. Because I don't think, like I said, I do not, from everything that I've heard, I think the younger generation, and when I say younger, I'm talking about 40 on down. I'm not just talking about teenagers, but 40 on down. I think there's a tremendous amount of energy and wanting to do something. And to be very honest about it, I believe many of them, and I'm talking about Muslims in particular, are frustrated with the elders who are basically, they see us as holding them back. And we can't do that. We have to help them, inshallah.
If I may, actually, Ahmed, it's well said by Brother Karim Abdul Mateen. However, I just want to emphasize that learning from the history, especially when we study the seerah of the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, and how he handled this issue in particular, I think there is so much that we learn. And sometimes we come to the conclusion that it's not either or. It's not the youth way or the old generation way. It's the combination of the two. And I think usually that's what is required. The energy of the youth, but with the wisdom of the old. Because that old generation, they went through a lot. And especially talking about not only of the African American community, which went through a history of hundreds of years of slavery and a lot of sacrifice, a lot of vuln, a lot of aggression and transgression, and a lot of suffering. So all that is being actually in the memory of these generations for many, many years. But that combined with what the immigrant community brought from where they came from. Don't forget, many of these people who came immigrants, many people look at them as people who came looking for money, looking for the dollar, looking for a better life, which is true. But in the same time, don't forget, many of those people came from places of war. Some people came from Afghanistan. People came from Iraq. People came from Syria. People came from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, where actually they were devastated, and many people came from different areas, not necessarily looking just for a better life, but actually running away from aggression and transgression, hoping that they will find in the United States a stable place where they will be able to establish themselves. So actually that memory of what people, and I can speak about myself. I grew up in a time where I was under the French colonialization. I still remember those vivid memories as a child when the war was going on for 7 years and a half, and I was only seven years old and 9 years old by the time Algeria gained independence. From all that, actually, all this mixed, I think it teaches us some wisdom, and it teaches us some energy and some vision, how to tackle issues and hopefully find peaceful solutions rather than devastating solutions that can destroy the country. So from that perspective, what I really look for out of this crisis, it is an opportunity. The way I would like to look at it, it is a crisis, no doubt. It is a big crisis, actually, that is coming from an accumulation of a lot of aggression that happened and racism that happened throughout many years. But in the same time, I believe this is an opportunity. And I believe today, more than any time before, there are many people who are opening their eyes, that something should be done. And they are opening their eyes that maybe we can extend our hands to other people who never extended their hands before, and we can work together to find a solution. I think we should be having some dialogue at different level, at a community dialogue, a city dialogue, maybe a state dialogue, maybe a nation dialogue, where people can keep talking to each other for a while in order to come to an understanding that hopefully will bring a lot of healing. Remember, this issue is not just a legal issue. This issue is a spiritual issue. It's a psychological issue. It's a social issue. It's a historical issue. So the healing has to be at different levels. And I believe to come to that real healing, I think it's going to take a lot of work. And that work should start from now, where at different levels, old generation and young generation have some sort of a debate, dialogue, open hearts and open mind, and talk. And hopefully by the end of the day, then there will be some understanding of what way should be the way towards the solution. I am sure there are many people who are angry, and maybe they are seeing the older generation are not being able, and we're not being able to bring about a solution. But that's okay. That kind of energy is needed, but it should not be a destructive energy. It should be a positive energy that can be channeled towards finding a peaceful and good solution to the problem.
Jazakumullah khair. Just wanted to add a couple of things, Sheikh Jafar. You pointed the importance of looking at the seerah to see the importance of the balance between the young and old. I think suffice it to remember how the Rasul struggled to gain a lot of support in Mecca, but it was in Medina after they were destroyed by the Hurub of Bu'ath, and many of the elders had perished in Medina, that he was able to find that support to gain, because there were a lot of young people with energy. But at the same time, those young people with energy had the elders of the Rasul والسلام, the likes of Sayyidina Abu Bakr and Uthman and Sayyidina Umar and Ali radiallahu anhum ajma'een. That's one. And then something else strikes me from my academic training as a biomedical engineer, which conveys the same message. And Allah teaches us the same lesson multiple ways. So follow the metaphor here. We learned as a biomedical engineer, I worked with stem cells that were trying to differentiate stem cells to turn into cartilage or to turn into bone. And stem cells are basically like the youth. They are not yet that final product. And then you have the mature cell, which is the cartilage cell. It is the end product. That is your adult. When we try to differentiate the stem cell into the cartilage cell, sometimes it does brilliantly, and sometimes it goes completely off the rails. And if you go further back, if you put stem cells without the right environment, sometimes they can be destructive and turn cancerous or kill the supporting tissue. Likewise, if you try to replenish cartilage with just cartilage itself, it doesn't have the energy. its energy is already spent. All right, it has a limited ability to heal. But when you put the two together, you get amazing results. The older cells basically show the younger cells this is the way. And the younger cells say, hey, we have some energy, so we're going to take you along for the ride. And it brings youth to the older cells, subhanAllah. حتى يتبين لهم أنه الحق. Right? Until it is shown to us, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will show us his signs in absolutely everything until we come to the conclusion that this deen is the way. Subhanallah. And so that's I hope that loops that question well. This is a painful one to maybe go into, Brother Abdul Mateen, but it's a question that I think a lot of people maybe have a blind eye to, and they're not aware of it. As an African American man, what is it like living and raising children in this country? This religion is one that commands us to read, but I think a lot of us have not done their due diligence of understanding the situation at hand. And what I mean by that, some people are blind to the different set of written and unwritten rules that African Americans live with. Could you share with us the very different set of rules that you have witnessed or been preconditioned to believe exist as an African American, as a father, as a counselor, some of the things that you've seen?
That's not painful, but it's a difficult question. Because some of these things that you grow up with, you kind of take for granted. I can tell you that I grew up in New York City to be exact, but my parents were from Virginia, and it was at a time when segregation was still enforced. And I remember from the very early years traveling down to Virginia and spending the summer. And that really informed me about what this was all about. Because we would travel through, get down to Maryland. And in Maryland, you have what they call a Mason-Dixon line. And you can actually see a marker on the highway where it says the Mason-Dixon line. But when you get past Washington, D.C., at that time, you could not stop to get food, use the bathroom, things we take for granted today. Stopping, going into a store to go to the bathroom or to get something to drink or whatever the case is. You could not do that because those establishments were owned by white people, and it was frowned upon, not just frowned upon. My parents, we never stopped. She would pack a big basket of food, and we thought it was all fun. It would be lots of, chicken and potato salad and all these other things. And we thought it was fun. But as I got older, I understood why it was being done. Okay. That we could not stop and use the restroom. And I would ask, and she said, no, we're almost there. We're almost there. That was because segregation was still in place at that point. Okay. They had separate bathrooms. Usually the dirty one, the ones that they didn't bother cleaning, that was for what they call colored people. And when I say colored people, I don't mean just African Americans. I mean anybody, any person of color, anybody. And that's what that was for. Some places they weren't even accessible. So that's, you grew up with that. When I got down to my family's home, at that particular point, the Black people all lived in one community, which was a good thing and something we've gotten away from. And, we've lost a lot in the process, but they had separate churches. And I remember passing this one particular church going into Scottsburg, Virginia. It was this church right in the middle of the town. And I would say, Mommy, why can't we go to the church? She said, oh, that's a white church. Okay. And I said, okay. And then we went further up the road, got into the Black community, and that was the Black church. Okay. And that's the way the South was at that time. It's not like that now, but recently, I mean, I was contemplating relocating down to a place in North Carolina, and one of my cousins came to me quietly and said, "Be careful where you live. Okay, make sure you live with your own. You can't pick just any place." Now, desegregation has been a law, but what's in the people's hearts hasn't changed. Going forward more recently, I used to live, when I moved out of New York City, I lived in a place called Sydney, New York, which is outside of Oneonta, in between Oneonta and Binghamton, New York. And I had a house in Sydney. And in my mailbox, I used to get Ku Klux Klan flyers and mail. This is in New York State. Okay. So for those who think that racism is just in the South, no. Racism is throughout this country. And one of the rules that we have, because we lived in New York City, it wasn't quite the same as living in the South. But one of the rules, you don't basically at that point, you live, you be respectful of people, of all people. Personally, I've never been stopped by police, but my sons have. Okay. I think at least two of my sons I know have been stopped and frisked for no apparent reason. And the thing that, that makes them angry, but the thing that, they've been taught is don't react, just go along. I remember one time I was traveling down south, and I was stopped by police officers for travel. He had a legitimate reason to stop me because I was speeding past the car that was slowing me down, and he stopped me. And he said, we had a dialogue, and the dialogue went like, "Yes, sir," "No, sir," and respectful. But later my daughter asked me, "Why did you talk to that man like that? He was being disrespectful to you. Why did you talk to him like that?" That's the way you have to deal if you don't want to avoid a problem. Okay. So, and it's been I used to work out in, outside of Albany, going towards Oneonta. And I was stopped allegedly for a traffic violation in the middle of the night. But I knew that's not what it was. Because it was like 1 o'clock in the morning. There was nobody. It was one of those towns where you go through the town in like 30 seconds. And I got stopped for an alleged traffic violation. And I had to remind myself that, okay, this is annoying. I'm tired. I'm ready to go home. But I can't overreact to this because I know what's at stake. And everybody Black people in general, that comes ingrained in you. You know what it is. And I hate to use this analogy, but I'll use it for the sake of understanding the headset. We were told like we would be in Virginia in South, and down South they have a lot of snakes, a lot of poisonous snakes and some non-poisonous snakes. And I apologize, Allah forgive me for this analogy, but I'll explain it this way. And we were always taught, it's a snake. You don't know whether it's poisonous or not, so leave it alone. And that analogy was brought over to how we dealt with white people. Okay, you don't know what's in their hearts, so just stay away from them. And that kind of, in a nutshell, is the rule that we live by.
SubhanAllah, I've had several deep discussions with Brother Abdul Mateen, but always more stories come out when I'm hearing this. A lot of this stuff I've never heard before, and it's kind of makes the hair on your neck stand up hearing these stories. So thank you for digging deep and sharing that with us. Any comments, Sheikh Jafar?
Yeah, actually, I have a comment on the last statement that's being said about the snakes. You know, and that's exactly why we need community and state and nationwide discussion. I think that kind of healing probably will make the the Black African American community discover some of the good hearts that are there among the white community, and I believe there are. And also it gives a chance to many of the people who are in the white community to discover the goodness that is there in the hearts of the African American community. That kind of trust will take a lot of work to be established. So therefore, you will know that actually the snakes that are poisonous, hopefully they are a minority. They are a small minority. And these should not be let to destroy the entire society. So that's where actually, I know it's hard, it's easy to be said than to overcome that kind of feeling, because that kind of feeling is the accumulation of many hundreds of years of what happened in the past. And I'm not going to marginalize that or just assume it doesn't exist. It is there, and I don't blame them for feeling that way. But in the same time, practically speaking and looking at the reality to overcome this issue and come out of it with a real solution, I think it takes that kind of work where to establish that kind of trust, where uh, hopefully we will not look at each other as snakes and scorpions and other. No, hopefully we will come to the level where we really appreciate the humanity that is there in everyone. And actually, that's exactly what the Prophet ﷺ did. You know what we learn as Muslims, alhamdulillah, in that beautiful history, the Prophet ﷺ, the way he used to talk to those people even who were hurting him, to the people who were really insulting him, to the people who were really pushing him around. But in the same time, he was hoping that they will understand that this doesn't work, that this will bring no solution, that actually there is another layer that you can discover when you give me a chance to communicate with you properly and to discover the goodness in me, and then I will discover the goodness in you. I mean, can you imagine Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu? What was his position before he became a Muslim? And he was that kind of person who was planning to go and kill the Prophet ﷺ. But then he changed. So I believe by creating an atmosphere that will help many people to change, rather than always having this kind of the situation is always black and white. That is one camp or the other. There is nothing in between. No, we have to work hard. First, on ourselves, each group to work hard on ourselves to discover the negativity that is there in each one of us and be able to take care of it. And also to see the goodness in each one and be able to benefit from it. I believe we are one society, and we have to work as one society, and we should be able to come up with a solution for the entire society. That's what I believe. And I believe every time actually I look back to the history of Islam, I see that as the solution. I believe Islam is the solution. By the way, just yesterday, actually, I was reading, every time I come to know about a black man being transgressed upon, I remember Bilal. And look what happened to Bilal. Look what happened to Bilal in the history, where he was being tortured in the desert of Mecca, and a rock was on his chest, and he was being whipped. But then what did Bilal become after that? I think that's the kind of history that we would like to study. That how can we empower our brothers and sisters positively, so they will be able to change themselves and change the environment around them positively. So hopefully, Bilal became Bilal, the mu'adhin, became Bilal, the scholar, became Bilal, the respected companion, became Bilal, who was on the top of the Kaaba in front of all those leaders of Quraysh, who was calling adhan. You know, it takes that kind of work. It's not easy. It's not easy at all, but in the same time, it's possible.
Ahsan Sheikh Jafar and Abdul Mateen. You know, interesting thing that comes to my mind when we mention the story of Bilal is the liberation of Bilal, and that was how the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, you know, he basically told Sayyidina Abu Bakr, use your privilege to free him.
Yes.
You know, that there is this system of slavery that's there, and you, Abu Bakr, yes, you are of the same faith, but you are the same color at least as those, or you are accepted in certain ways before the oppression was directed towards them themselves. And I think part of this distrust and these metaphors that are put up, comparing certain folks to snakes, has a lot to do with, well, you know, you've come to us as wolves in sheep's clothing sometimes, where there was the desire to help, or at least the superficial desire to help, but underneath there was something working against us all along. And so yes, we do believe in the goodness in people's hearts, and we hope that we can come together and unite based off of the purity of our hearts, not the color of our skins. At the same time, as you mentioned, Sheikh Jafar, there are years, there are centuries there since the inception of this country of trauma, and before this country was made. And as Brother Abdul Mateen pointed out, the Constitution sounds very good in paper, but it means something else, because when we said we the people was not the am meaning that we consider the word to be. It was not a general meaning of people. It was we, the, and in parentheses, the white people who formed this country. And if we are going to realize our role as the moral compass of this country, and we can be, then it is our duty to provide the correct tafsir of the words, because it may be, as the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam said, that we understand something in the text that you yourself, when you wrote it, didn't understand, and we understand that this is what it should be and this is what it should look like. So may Allah make it easy for our hearts to come together based off of piety, and to move towards meaningful solutions. Folks, we have a lot of questions coming in through the Facebook and YouTube. I want to continue to encourage you to put those in there. I will not be able to get to all of them for a couple of reasons. One of them being that some of the questions will be more appropriate for subsequent sessions that we have. But one place for us to start is, one of the questions is, general inquiry is, how is the African American Muslim population dealing with the current events? Maybe Brother Abdul Mateen, what's your intel on that? What's the pulse you think in the African American Muslim?
I was actually, I can speak for, when I speak, I'm not sure all that's going on here in the Capital District, but I was very pleased to see that in one of the protests that was taking place in New York City, I saw different African American masajids. They were very, very visible. Okay, as a matter of fact, one particular masjid, MIB, Mosque of Islamic Brotherhood in Manhattan, they had a large contingent out, and they were identifiable. They wore white thobes and whatnot, and they have a flag that for the community, and they were out as a group, as a part of that protest, and making very visible, making themselves visibly aligned with the struggle that's taking place, not with the foolishness that's going on in terms of the rioting and things of that nature, but the positive outpouring of articulating what our concerns are. They were very visible, and I was very pleased to see that. And there's other places around the country where that is also happening. Not so much to my knowledge here in the Capital District, but I think that is taking place throughout the country. Alhamdulillah.
Ahmed, please unmute.
Ahmed, assalamu alaikum.
Okay, I was muted. Yeah. So
Okay.
another related question is, how can we show support and be allies to both the African American Muslim community and African Americans in general? And we here clearly means coming from a suburban community, coming from a community that is mostly immigrant or not African American directly. So yes, what are some thoughts there? And we will have a subsequent session where we do a deep dive on this, but maybe let's do brief answers on this question, as it is very appropriate to the subject.
I believe that first and foremost, we as a suburban masjid, and we have to look at where we're at with all of this. What are we doing currently? And I think in many cases, not in all cases, but in many cases, I think the hearts are sincere, the hearts are sincere, but the effort is lacking. And we have to ask ourselves the question that in order to support this particular cause and this struggle, we have to ask ourselves, what kind of credibility do we have as a Muslim community? And currently, I don't believe, and I can only speak for this area, I don't believe that our credibility is very good because we have not been engaged with the community, the African American community. And I'm not going to put that entirely on this suburban masjid, because it's a two-way street. Okay, we've offered things and we've made things available, but then the question becomes, why don't people take advantage of the things that are available? And I've talked to some individuals regarding that, and I'm not going to belabor this because I know we're going to discuss it at a later point. But some individuals don't feel welcome, and those and whether that's their own insecurity or whether that's something that's real, Allah knows best. But I think we have to take a look at that. That's the first thing we have to do. We have to look at what we're doing or not doing and figure out a way to correct that. Then we have to become familiar with what's going on in the community. Not just in African American community, but the community as a whole. What are the problems that are going on? And not just the imam, but the community has to, let there rise out of you a band of people, a group of people, enjoining to the good and forbidding the evil. But you have to know what's evil in the society. You have to understand what is the evil in this society and this community. You have to become familiar with that. And then once you become familiar with that, everybody is not going to speak out, and everybody's not going to be intimately involved, but some people will. And those people can help identify what are the issues and what are the needs. And there are many, many things that can be done in terms of financial support, in terms of guidance. We have the answer. We have Islam. We have the answer. And we haven't done, myself first and foremost, but we haven't done enough in terms of giving dawah, in terms of giving dawah, as they say, in the street, and I don't mean just walking the street, but I mean going down to the most basic level of human need, giving dawah. And it doesn't have to be just preaching. It's being an example, being a role model. They see you involved in the community, concerned about the community, and offering solutions from an Islamic perspective, and giving the wisdom, like Sheikh Jafar was mentioning, the history of our history, our Islamic history, and giving those examples and parallels and helping them to devise better ways of dealing with the issues. I know that Albany, for instance, has a tremendous gang problem. Okay. where are the Muslims helping? I mean, some individuals who may have shops and things like that, they don't want to, get involved, and they're kind of shy, and they hold back. But what's being done to help the community? And that's something that I think that the first thing we have to look at is what do we need to do ourselves and correct within ourselves, and then get engaged and ask questions. We can come up with an idea in our own mind about what we think we should do, but is that what really needs to be done? And the only way, if you ask someone for help, you don't just give them help the way you think they need help. You ask, what kind of help do you need? How can I help you? How can I support you? So that's another dialogue that has to take place to find out, how can this Muslim community support you and be of assistance to you? Inshallah.
SubhanAllah. Thank you for that answer. As some of the main eyes of the community, Imam Ja'far, what do you think we can do? And I know this does require us to understand at a deeper level from those who are actually living this reality, and maybe we're not living this reality as much. Maybe we're living a diluted form of it, coming from colonized countries, whether we're descendants from people coming from Palestine like myself, under English occupation and Israeli occupation, or like yourself and most of North Africa or the Southeast Asia, under English or French occupation. We have some of these elements in our struggle, but it's obviously not at the same level. What do you think can be done to show allyship, to show support, and to really be a good support system and good dialogue and community building?
I believe what Brother Kareem Abdul Mateen has said. He said it very well and eloquently, that the burden is not on one person or one entity or the other. I think the burden is on all of us as a community, as a Muslim community, whether inner city masajid or suburban masajid. I think that kind of dialogue that I was talking about early on, I think if it takes place genuinely, with truthfulness, with sincerity, it may not drag everybody, but I think a good number of people probably can join in and can honestly participate in that dialogue. And hopefully it will be a learning process, that we will be able to learn about the pains of what other people are going through, and we discover that they are similar to the pains I went through. And then when that connection takes place, I think people will click. People at that time will realize that actually there are certain things that we can do together. Right now, I'm sure I know, I think everybody knows, in many of these masajid, it's not one united community. You find people coming as individuals, sometimes as groups. Sometimes people actually, what brings them together is their national relationships or their tribal relationships. All those are problems the Muslim community is already suffering from. So I think when we put all that together, hopefully that kind of dialogue, which we sometimes address in a khutbah of Jumu'ah or a dars, but that's not enough. I think it takes some serious dialogue that hopefully we can come up out of that dialogue with projects like the ones that Brother Kareem Abdul Mateen was suggesting. Maybe projects of towards the youth, of the African American youth who are in the inner city, whether in New York City or maybe somewhere else. How can we help them to be empowered, to get a better education, maybe to be able to speak up on behalf of their community, so we empower them? I think there are many things that can be done, but it takes that kind of genuine dialogue that will be convincing that there is so much work that can be done. But I trust that the Muslim community, being busy with so many issues, but I trust that the Muslim community can be educated to a level where they will be able to contribute towards this goal, inshallah ta'ala.
Well put, Sheikh Jafar. So going back to your point, Brother Abdul Mateen, you talked about the importance of us really stepping up and doing da'wah, not doing da'wah in the sense that is in our mind of perhaps proselytizing and telling people about Islam, but solving the issues in the community. And I just want to point out that that this is really one of the best ways that Islam spread in general. I mean, if we look at the West African tradition in Senegal, what the Imams did at that point, um, was they took it upon themselves to educate their surrounding community. And there were a lot of tribal religions. They decided to increase literacy for anyone, regardless of their religion. And when they saw that the Muslims in that community were educating, were increasing literacy, were raising the bar of the average citizen, then they asked, what is it in your heart that is compelling you to offer this? Or like and the way Islam reached that part is of the world is the same way it reached Indonesia and some of the other areas through trade, where this was a problem. You know, fair trade was not seen in many parts of the world. And when people brought a trade with honesty, it caused people to ask, well, what is this? Where is this honesty coming from? Because you could have easily lied to me like everybody else who's passed through this area. And so that does require us to ask some deep questions of what faculties do we have at our disposal that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has graced us with. And we realize that we will be asked about our knowledge and what we did with it, and our ability and our strength and what we did with it, and our wealth and what we did and what we spent it on the day of judgment. And this will be one of those paradigm shifting moments where we have to ask, where we should ask ourselves, these are the things that we have, these are the things Allah has blessed us with, how have we used it to better the community? And the community should be looked at in the broader sense here.
Can I point out one thing?
Yes.
I just want to shout out to, I think one of the best forms of dawah this community has is the sisters in their soup kitchen. I think that is one of the most excellent ways. And if we can look at that model of what they've done and how they've done that, I think, and extend it to other areas, I think that we could have some degree of success, inshallah.
Fair point. Definitely, we do need to recognize that, and jazakumullah khair for all those who have continued to make sure that is a continuous charity to the community. Going to the question that we already asked, how we can show support, I just want to add, Sheikh Jafar alluded to educating ourselves to a certain level. There is a lot of beneficial knowledge out there. If we want to support others, we need to know what we're trying to support. We need to know what the struggle is. And I've come across some good coursework. There's pretty much a college course available by Dr. Sherman Jackson, who's one of the Muslim professors in the University of Southern California. It's titled Islam and the Black American, and it goes all the way from the inception of the country and how the country was formed and on what basis it was formed, all the way up until the civil rights movement and normal culture. And so I think it's important for us to understand the journey of the African American man in general, and we can draw parallels depending on anywhere we've come through, but obviously their struggle is a tremendous struggle. And when we know that, we develop in our heart not just this feeling of we know this is wrong, but we understand the magnitude of what. Another way to educate yourself, if you, after coronavirus has passed away and you begin to travel again and you go to Washington, D.C., go to the Museum of African American History. It is life-changing to go there. There will not be a dry eye with any single person who goes through that. And if you have a dead heart and your heart still, and if your heart is stagnant and it's still stagnant after going through there, there's some serious issues. It's a very poignant experience to go through and walk through the halls of that museum, and that will allow us to shed some of the culturing that our mind has due to what society has perhaps brainwashed us with in terms of what our allegiances and what our thoughts should be towards this issue. And so sincere education, and this is the religion of Iqra, and there's a reason that was the first word that was revealed to our beloved Messenger alayhi salatu wassalam. And so we should do our due diligence to get correct facts, because there's a tremendous amount of misinformation, and there's a reason for that misinformation. I want to encourage folks to continue to add their questions to the YouTube page as well as the Facebook link. At this time, Sheikh Jafar, do you have any other comments? Do you have any questions that you want to reflect on? Brother Abdul Mateen as well.
Nothing in particular. Actually, one of the questions that was in my mind, in the beginning, as we were having a discussion, is I was wondering about the African American leadership, both Muslim and non-Muslims, whether they see the issue in the, with the same eye, or there are some differences of opinion. I'm not sure whether Brother Kareem has any input towards this, or maybe you, Ahmed, whether you have done any reading regarding this, because as I hear some echoes from here and there, I hear some people who are reacting and they are more aggressive in their words towards the issue. Yet I see some others who are maybe seeing that it's more towards educational solutions and maybe towards more long-term vision. So I'm not sure whether the leadership of the African American community is seeing these things in the same way.
I think that there's going to be a diverse outlook on this problem, just as it was back in the 60s. There was we all know, and just to briefly go backwards a little bit, and it also carries over into our present time. Martin Luther King, his approach was a peaceful approach, a passive approach. Not passive, but peaceful, because passive is the wrong word. It was not passive. And then you had others who had a much more militaristic attitude. Out of that time period came the Black Panther movement. And for what people may or may not know about the Black Panther movement mainly was to serve the community, the African American community, and to defend the African American community. And some people took up arms, and they had a vision of what they thought should be done. And the Black Panther, it was actually the Black Panther Party. Okay, there was a political element of that they understood that there was a need for change, but they also understood that there was a need for self-defense. That we weren't going to just sit down or turn the other cheek. That concept of turning the other cheek is a concept that came out of Christianity, that is ingrained in us. Someone does something or injustice to you, and you turn the other cheek. And basically, that was a extreme reaction to that. Okay, Martin Luther King's approach was more of a peaceful movement, and even today, you have the same elements. Okay, I would say that you have more elements today there's more options and there's a more aggressive approach. But I think the elder members of the African American community today, having gone through that experience of the 60s, they're a little bit more measured in their approach. Whereas you have younger individuals who may not be as patient and don't want to be patient, and feel that in order for things to change, we have to really, really shake things up. And this goes back to our previous discussion, but I think there's a blending of the two. Before I came here, the last thing my daughter said to me before I left the house was, she said, "Daddy, you're going to give them, which opinion are you going to give them? Are you going to give them your militant opinion or your old grandpa retired opinion?" And I said to her, somewhere in the middle. Okay, somewhere in the middle. Okay, because there clearly is a militant element. Okay, that hasn't manifested right now. That has not manifested itself. The violence that you see in these demonstrations is not from militant African Americans. That's not where it's coming from. But there is an element of that. The element of that is more related to self-defense. Okay, and you have another element that wants to use the political system. And then I think there needs to be a third element. And the third element relates to what Sheikh Jaffer and when we mentioned earlier in terms of the spiritual evolution, okay, that we need to look at something else besides just the politics, because the reality of it is that legislation alone will not solve the problem. Okay, so, but you have all of these different strands, and someone, I heard an imam down in Atlanta make the analogy of during the time of Prophet of Yusuf alayhi salam, where he mentioned how his father, when he sent his sons back into Egypt, he said, go in don't go in by the same gate, go in by different gates. Okay, and there's a lot of wisdom in that. Okay, don't use one method. There's not just one method. There are many methods, and we have to use all of them. You know, we have to avail ourselves of all of the different avenues of change. So I think that's where we are today. There's different people doing different things, and that's a good thing. And as long as it's something that's beneficial and something that's good, then we should encourage that.
Inshallah. We're coming towards the final minutes, and one thing that's important, and we're going to talk about this more in a subsequent session, I think the following session. But just to add on it, when you mentioned Martin's opinion, MLK's opinion, as well as his stance of being more peaceful without being a pacifist, it's important to note that and then you put that in contradistinction to what Malcolm X's approach was and the evolution of his approach, and how he actually became more mild over the time. He might have been stronger in his tone earlier in his years, but after doing Hajj, after learning more and networking with more people, he began to tone it back. Towards the end of his life, MLK actually became far more vocal and far more militant in his voice. And one of the essays he wrote, but he never gave, because he was assassinated before giving it, was titled "Why America Might Go to Hell." This was the title of one of his essays, but he was assassinated before he ever got the chance to give that. And the NAACP and some other groups really started distancing themselves from his view as things evolved. And I do want to echo what you said about taking different paths, as long as those paths are pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and bring us closer to justice. And I think it's important for us to realize that even if something is done wrong that disagrees with our fitrah in these protests, that we need to realize the context that has created that storm that maybe we're not very thrilled with. I think maybe we have time for one more question, as we have to close for Maghrib at 8:30. And this is, I guess, a question that makes a lot of sense for our community as a mostly immigrant Muslim community. Maybe Sheikh Jafar, you can take this one. Don't you think the immigrant Muslim community should know the feeling, at least in some degree, of what the African American Muslim community is going through? Because we face the similar amount of prejudice coming from the lands that we're coming from. And we are beginning to face some of these prejudices here, particularly since 9/11 and some of the other recent events.
Ahmed, if you can briefly summarize the question, because actually I did not really get the question very well.
Yeah. Do you think that the immigrant Muslim community should actually be very understanding to the struggle of the African American Muslim? Because we've actually, if we look at it, what we've faced from the countries that we've come from is a very similar struggle, although it may not be as magnified as what's going on here.
I believe, I believe the immigrant community has a lot to learn from the history of the African American community. I myself need to learn, about that history and from that history. And that's why actually we are not doing enough in our communities to expose ourselves to that kind of history. So we will be able to see and we will be able to identify with it. So from that perspective, this is step number one. Step number one is let's learn more about the history. Step number two, we would like also the African American community and other communities to learn about the history or where we came from. Because actually there is, as I said, there is a lot of similarity. But from that perspective, we would like all that when it is merged together and combined, then we will come up with some sort of what is the best solution to the problems that we are facing. We are, whether we are immigrant community or the African American community or some other communities, there are some common problems that we are all facing. And this is one of them. The way I look at it, although it is primary, racism is primary, the issue of the African American community, but actually it concerns all of us. Because racism is not a problem of one group or the other. Racism is bad, and it is the problem of everyone. And therefore, we all have to tackle it, and we are all concerned. So therefore, if we address it from this point of view, especially from the Islamic point of view, I think addressing the Muslim community should have no problem to identify the problem, should have no issue to identify with the problem and see that I should be concerned with this. The only thing that which is a big thing is education, how to educate, especially how to educate the younger generation, which 5 years from now, 10 years from now, they should be very well motivated to play a part in the solution rather than in the problem. So from that perspective, I believe the immigrant community, if well approached, if good educational system is being done within the community to identify the issues and and expose the community to these kind of things, I'm sure that there will be good results, inshallah.
Inshallah, barakallah feek, Imam Ja'far. I think within the last couple of answers to the questions, we've actually laid out what we expect in the coming sessions, which we have. We will send out information about the coming sessions, but we've heard in one of Brother Abdul Mateen's answers what that template is, and that's rectifying the self, then rectifying the community, the Islamic community, and then rectifying the broader community as a result. And those will be 3 of the subsequent sessions, followed with some more historical output. Another thing is we talked about discussions in education. We know that educating and learning in groups is easier than learning alone. We know that working out with a workout buddy is easier to find the gains than working out alone. And some of the longitudinal projects that we inshallah aspire to get towards is to undergo some serious educational transformation, whether that's in the form of guided book discussions from our community or members in our community to learn about this history, to discuss this history, to see the parallels from previous episodes in history to now, and to mobilize efforts to bring better solutions to our community. And this is also, we're trying to just get the ball rolling and start having these very important conversations. And there are folks in the audience that have expertise. If you feel like you have that expertise and you can offer, this is your time to talk. We want to know who you are, and we want to see what can be done to bring about justice in the most comprehensive and complete way that will be presentable in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and beneficial to the people. I ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes that a realization that we see in our lives, and if not, that it is a realization that is realized on this world. The last thing I want to ask is Sheikh Ja'far, as we're closing, can you close us with dua before we sign off for the evening, if there are no other comments from Brother Abdul Mateen or yourself?
No, I don't have any other comments right at the moment, inshallah.
So Ahmed, you can close. I have no comments.
Okay. Sheikh Ja'far, would you like to close with a dua, perhaps?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. We pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He will bring peace to our hearts. He will bring peace to our lives. He will bring peace to our brothers and sisters within the Muslim community. And He will bring peace to the entire society and to the entire humanity. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He will make us able to be agents of peace within ourselves and to the environment surrounding us. Allahumma anta as-salam wa minka as-salam تباركت يا ذا الجلال والإكرام. ربنا اغفر لنا ولإخواننا الذين سبقونا بالإيمان ولا تجعل في قلوبنا غلا للذين آمنوا ربنا إنك رؤوف رحيم. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين.
Jazakumullah khair, everybody, for tuning into this important discussion. Please keep your eyes open for the subsequent discussions in this series. Jazakumullah khair for tuning in once again. Please keep us in your du'as, and the work is just beginning. Let's look forward to working together on these future sessions and future projects. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله.